So a little while ago, I beat Final Fantasy on the Game Boy Advance. It was the Dawn of Souls cartridge, and I enjoyed it. It was certainly a lot easier than I thought it was going to be, but I still had a good time playing through it. It only took me about probably 18 hours to play through it, and I admittedly, even though I love turn-based combat, I never really went through a Final Fantasy game. I would get to probably the halfway point, somewhere around there, and I would stop playing. Maybe to take a break and I never went back to it, or another game came out and I just never went back to it. So I really wanted to sit down and play through one of these games because, like I said, I love turn-based combat, and it's frankly a crime that I never actually beat a Final Fantasy. So after going through the GBA remake, I decided to go all the way back to the series roots with Final Fantasy on the NES. Now admittedly, this is not the first time that I've tried to play through Final Fantasy on the NES. I really slept on this game because I was like, well, it's an NES RPG, super old school, there's probably gonna be a ton of grinding and a ton of cheap deaths. Which I was right to a certain extent. But I persevered, and I really discovered that I love this game. I think it's an awesome RPG, and I think it's a great RPG for a series to get started with. So, without further ado, let's talk about Final Fantasy for the NES. Man, that prelude still sounds good in all of its 8-bit glory. It still captures that beautiful atmosphere that Final Fantasy has always had. Now, the cool thing about this game is that you get to customize your party. There's 6 classes here: Fighter, Thief, Red Mage, White Mage, Black Mage, and a Black Belt. Basically, 3 melee-centered characters and 3 magic-centered characters. My party makeup was 2 fighters, a white mage, and a black mage. Being able to customize your party like this right out of the gate offers tons of replayability, because this is definitely one of those games that you're probably not just going to go through it at least once. You're probably going to play through it multiple times just to try out different classes and everything like that. Well, anyway, once you're done creating your characters, the game opens up. First thing you gotta do is go into town. This may seem a little bit weird, but when you start the game, you don't have any weapons. No armor, no weapons, no items, no spells. So if you just walk around the overworld thinking that you already got all this stuff, your adventure's not gonna last very long. Now, little tip here for people who are not really used to old school RPGs: you have to talk to everybody. This is how you're gonna progress through the game. No quest markers here, so even if it's an introvert's worst nightmare, you have to talk to everybody. Now, when you think of Final Fantasy, you probably think of these huge stories with really deep, memorable characters, like Cloud and Aerith. But in this game, there are none. If you have played this game, try to think of all the memorable characters. You can't. In fact, I actually like this kind of storytelling. Here, it's more about the world, the environment, rather than individual characters. Your party members never interact with each other, which I think is okay. I like to think that they're all bullshitting with each other while they're on this quest. It is an NES game, so using your imagination still helps. I'll try to give a summary of this game without giving away too much. You are the 4 warriors of light, each carrying a crystal that represents one of the elements: earth, fire, wind, and water. Defeating various bosses in this game will cause the orbs to glow once again, and you put all those powers together and you can eventually defeat the great evil. I think the story really works well here because you solve a lot of small problems with each town. Each town in the game has its own issue. In the very first town, in Corneria, Princess Sarah has been kidnapped by the evil knight Garland, so it's your job to go and save her. It's a lot of simple stuff, but it really works out. You know what I really like about this game? The combat. Combat in the first Final Fantasy is some of the most engaging combat the series has ever had. It's completely turn-based here, and there's a lot of nuances to it that makes me think this is my favorite system that Final Fantasy ever had. The battle system here is really in-depth, and you really got to be paying attention to what you're doing. There's your normal stuff like your physical attacks and your magic attacks, but there is so much depth to this system that I think it makes it really fun. The thing I love most is you cannot take a battle off here. If you take a battle off here, you will pay the price, because one thing that it does is an effective attack. Let's say that I kill a monster, and if there was another party member that was targeting that monster, they're attacking essentially a dead monster. Now, thinking about this in a literal sense, yeah, it's stupid. Why is my party member attacking a dead monster when there's one that's standing there? But the cool thing is, you kind of develop a feel for every single monster. You sort of figure out the range of their hit points, and it helps you to create more efficient strategies. It makes me think of the Shin Megami Tensei and the Persona games, because it's the same thing in those games. If you take a battle off, you are going to pay the price for it. You're going to lose hit points, you're going to waste time, and really, that's not something you want to be doing. I think a lot of people who try this game out for the first time, or even people who have gone back to this game, are not going to like this battle system because it is really slow and they're wasting turns essentially, which I can understand, but I think it adds to a lot of strategy, and this might be the most strategic Final Fantasy there is, aside from Final Fantasy Tactics on PS1. The battles do feel a lot slower, and the visuals are obviously not the best thing around. It is very rudimentary. There is also a random element with this game, and it can be really exciting, but it can also be really infuriating. I'll give you an example. If you drink a health potion on the overworld, it's always 30 hit points. If you drink one in combat, it can be whatever. This also applies to spells, so same sort of thing. If you have a Cure 2 in the overworld, it's always going to heal the same amount. If you use it in battle, it's going to be random. If you use a Fire 2, there is a chance that it'll do even less damage than a Fire 1 spell. It does sometimes feel like the game just doesn't want you to win. And speaking of spells, there are some spells in this game that don't work. So I would highly recommend getting a guide just so you can see what spells do and do not work. That way you don't waste gil. Or, sorry, in this game they call the currency gold, but I'll just keep calling it gil. Now, spells do extra damage to certain enemies. Perfect example, using fire on an undead enemy will do extra damage. Dealing fire to an ice enemy will do extra damage. This also applies to certain items in the game. But unfortunately, there are some items in this game that also don't work properly. One thing that definitely makes this game different from later entries is the magic system. In later games, you have two bars. You have your magic points and your health points. But in this game, you can only cast a certain number of spells every single day. After that, you have to rest. When you start the game, mages are gonna feel borderline useless because they can't do any damage with their physical attacks. And you also can't use very many spells. So at the start of the game, mages are very underwhelming, but as time goes on, they get more and more powerful, and eventually they're going to be the things that you rely on the most. Unfortunately, when you get to the end of the game and you start using the level 7 and level 8 spells, they are just copies of instant kill spells. They're not very reliable, and honestly, you'll probably only really use level 6 spells even when you're at the final boss. One other thing though, the level ups. It feels so good to level up in this game. I can't exactly explain why, but there's just something about it that makes it more satisfying than other entries in the series. But there is also that chance of randomness here. So there are times where you'll level up and you'll gain like 20 hit points, and then there's times when you'll only gain 1 hit point. The Black Mage in particular, he's always getting horrible level ups, and it's really aggravating. But when you get a really good one, you totally forget all about the bad ones. Now I think the big question on everybody's mind is, how is the grind? Is it really that bad? Yes and no. When you first start this game, you are gonna have to grind a little bit. To get to the Temple of Fiends, I would honestly recommend being at level 4. That way, when you eventually cross that bridge, you're not going to get destroyed right away by the new monsters. The biggest part is grinding for money. I find that to be the biggest thing that I had to grind for, just to afford some of the spells, because when you get to like level 3 and level 4 spells, it's just astronomical how much they cost. There is a way to kind of speed up this grinding process though. At first though, you're just gonna have to go through the traditional way, just running back and forth, fighting the same enemies over and over. Until you get Fire 2. When you're able to get the Fire 2 spell, make your way to the Peninsula of Power. This is a little glitch on the map that lets you fight enemies that are meant for way later in the game. Another question you probably have is, how is the difficulty? Well, it's an NES game, so by law it has to be hard as shit, and there are plenty of enemies and there are plenty of dungeons that will kick the shit out of you. Easily the hardest dungeon for me has to be the Ice Cave. Not because the enemies are tough or I just went in there under-leveled, it's because there are enemies that just one-shot you for no fucking reason. They're called sorcerers, and whenever you see them, you just have an instant heart attack. I don't know why they thought it was a good idea to just throw in random kills everywhere in this place, but it is just horrible. Another thing that makes this game difficult is you cannot save when you're inside a dungeon. You can only save when you rest at an inn or if you use a tent or house or cabin on the overworld. That's what makes this game so hard. If you make it to the boss of a dungeon and die, you have to redo the whole damn thing. Another dungeon that I didn't really like was the Earth Cave. And that's because you have to leave this dungeon first, and then you can complete it. Basically, you go in, kill the vampire, you find this stone slab, then you have to leave. You go to the Giant's Cave, then you have to come back with a certain tool, then you can remove the stone slab, and then you can progress through the dungeon. End result is 25 minutes of wasted time. Aside from those two major duds, the only one I also have a problem with is the volcano. If you walk over lava in this level, the screen flashes white. So I'm not going to show that because I don't want someone to have a fucking seizure watching my review. Getting back to more positive things about this game, when you get to a certain point in the game, you have the freedom to do whatever you want. There aren't that many games from this era that really allow you to just do whatever you want. Do things out of order. Find new ways to go through the game. There is so much replay value here. Us RPG fans welcome that with open arms. The overworld in this game really is something special, especially for this time. It feels huge, even though when you look at the map, it looks pretty small. There's a nice flow that goes along with the overworld. It's not like you have to backtrack all the time, and when you do have to backtrack though, it can be a little bit painful. But if you're able to get some of the transportation, like the ship or the airship, it really makes traveling easy. And there's not a whole lot of times where I felt too restricted. Maybe at the beginning of the game because obviously you're just starting out. But man, it opens up really quickly. Some of the towns are really cool to explore. There are some towns that have been devastated by the lands and everything like that. Some have been invaded by vampires. There's one town that you can't even get to unless you travel there with the airship. The only downside to the overworld would be the ocean. And it's not because it's horrible. The problem is the enemies are always the same. You get the odd eyes and the sharks and a couple of others. There's no other tougher enemies than these guys. So if you're really high level, it's going to get pretty annoying when you have to stop to fight these guys when most of the time you can just destroy them really quickly. The only time that the enemies in the water get tougher is when you go into the rivers and creeks. For whatever reason, the enemies in here are just insanely difficult. Well, that just leaves me with one more thing I want to talk about. The final dungeon. When you go into this dungeon, be prepared for some serious shit, alright? If you're not at least level 30, you're gonna get killed pretty much instantly. So this is another part of the game where you will have to grind a little bit. I would suggest trying to get to this dungeon when you're at least level 30. That way, when you move in, you're not just gonna get annihilated by the poison dragons and everything like that. Also, you have to fight 5 bosses in this one dungeon. It's one hell of an endurance run. So make sure you supply yourself with tons of healing items and potions, because if you don't, you're gonna be kicking yourself in the balls. Reaching the final boss takes a lot of time and patience, and even a little bit of luck along the way. But when you do, and you beat him, man, you're on the top of the world. And that's it. That's Final Fantasy for the NES. I could go on and on and on about this game, but I gotta stop at some point. I really do recommend this game. Even just playing it for a little bit, just to see where the series began. Just to see where RPGs have evolved from. And this game isn't very long either. It only took me about 20 to 25 hours to beat. I love this game, flaws and all. But I totally understand if people don't want to play this version of it. If you want to play a good version of Final Fantasy, try out the Game Boy Advance version. There's other remakes out there like the PS1 version and the PSP version. The PS1 version is good, but the loading times are a bit annoying. So I'd say stick with the GBA because it's pretty much just as good as the PS1 version, but there's no lag.